kind of as I'm talking. So thank you for coming to the CHAI seminar. If you don't already know, CHAI is the Causality in Healthcare AI Hub here in the UK. We're a multi-institution collaboration of both industrial and academic partners working on developing causal AI solutions for healthcare and pushing the sort of state-of-the-art research forward. So if you're not already signed up for our newsletter, you can do so at the website. And just so you know, this meeting is recorded. So if you would not like to show up in the recordings after speaking or something, please reach out to the CHAI email in the chat. So to get started, I want to welcome our speaker, Dr. Yingzhen Li. Dr. Li is currently a senior lecturer in machine learning at the Department of Computing at Imperial College London, and she's also a Turing Fellow at the Alan Turing Institute. Before joining Imperial, she was also a senior researcher at Microsoft Research Cambridge, and her current research interests include trustworthy machine learning, generative machine learning, and approximate inference. So if that is everything, I think that we're ready to begin the talk. So whenever you're ready, Dr. Li.
Great. So thank you for the introduction, and I'm very happy to be here. Sorry that I cannot open my camera at the moment due to some issues, but yeah, I'm very happy to answer any questions you have during the talk. So just to clarify that, so my expertise is really within the machine learning field, right? And I'm just starting to get into this healthcare domain, which is like the theme of this CHAI AI Hub, right? But CHAI AI Hub is also about, causality, where I also have some interest on that. So that's basically why I'm here today. And I want to tell you about essentially what we've been doing in the recent few years that tries to, introduce the ideas of, this causal representation learning to the world of deep generative models. Okay, so just to motivate where I start this journey, so I want to take the time back to basically 8 years ago when I was still a PhD student. I did an internship at Disney Research in Pittsburgh in America with my awesome internship supervisor, Stephen Mant. And at that time, I was very interested in generative models already, and we were looking at video generation problems. So this video I show you here is basically what was the state of the art 8 years ago. So we need to appreciate that this generative AI has progressed very far, okay, just in less than 10 years. But essentially, the problem is the following. So we want to train a video generation model in a way that we can achieve what is called controllable video generation. For example, in this case, the data set looks like this, where it contains basically different characters performing different actions. I want to train a generative model that can fit on this data set so that in test time, when I ask it to generate new videos, I can generate the same characters performing different actions or like different characters performing the same actions. So this was also very popular at that time, and it is a topic called disentangled representation learning in deep generative modeling field. Just to note here that the data set we had at that time is just these videos. There is no label about which character you are currently looking at and what kind of action this character is performing in the video. So it's pure unsupervised learning, but we want to do something in some interesting way so that the trained generative model can actually achieve this disentangled representation of starting information and temporal information. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, if you're familiar with, let's say, ideas like deep generative models or version autoencoders, so this shouldn't be too surprising for you. So essentially, what we've done in that paper here was the following. So we built a latent variable model that can generate this video sequence, but we grouped the latent variables into two groups. So the first latent variable here, F, represent this global starting information, and in this particular example of performing characters, it kind of represent this content information like the outfit of the character. The other group of latent variables is this Z1 to ZT variables, which represent the underlying dynamics of the observed sequence. At least that was what we are hoping for. And in this particular example of acting characters, so this will basically represent like these actions, like walking of the character. Okay, so the rest of the recipe is still very standard. So at that time, transformers was not that popular yet. So we used basically LSTMs to parameterize these transition arrows, and also later on project your latent variables to the observed video frames using a convolutional neural architecture. And all these neural networks are learned via this version inference method, or basically the VAE framework. And you only train these on the observation data only, which was basically the videos. Okay, so I already showed you in the previous slides that it works out. Okay, and that was basically why we can publish this paper. But now I think I can start to actually criticize my own publication, okay, due to some interesting facts. So previously, I showed you that this model in practice can achieve this disentangled representation learning, but there is no guarantee that such architecture can achieve this separated representation of the starting information and temporal information in all trainings. So let me give you some examples that powerful neural networks can cheat in this example. Okay. So the first thing here is if you have previously used the LSTM recurrent neural network architecture, then you might know that in the LSTM network, there exists hidden cells, which act as these recurrent deterministic states that will be updated during time. So there is a possibility that certain setting of the LSTM weights will correspond to a model where the LSTM can learn to copy the previous state and bring it forwards, right? So if it actually works in that way, then essentially it is possible for the hidden cells in the LSTM to store the global information, in this case the outfit of the characters, and then just copy forward. Right, so in this case, ZT is possible to actually capture the content information. On the other hand, you might have noticed from the first slide of this visualization that actually the underlying dynamics of the data sequence is actually deterministic, okay? And for a deterministic dynamical system, as long as you know the transition equations as well as the initial conditions, then you can simulate the entire trajectory up to numerical error. Okay, so this basically means if the global variable f captures these initial conditions, then essentially it also captures the dynamic information as like the movement information of this character moving video sequence. Okay, so basically what I'm trying to tell you from this content example is that nowadays, if people show you a deep generative model with some kind of graphical model and then claim to you that okay, this variable will learn this representation, another variable will learn another representation, you might want to take their claim or take my claim with a pinch of salt, because we can actually find some peculiar neural network settings that they can cheat and then falsify this claim. Well, obviously, at that time, I was only a graduate student. I want to really make these things work. And my solution back then is essentially this deep learning alchemy that I did a lot of engineering work to actually make the model work in practice. It works quite well, actually. What I'm trying to say here is that I'm not trying to diminish the value of engineering in deep learning research. In fact, if you look at the current progress in generative AI, actually quite a lot of very significant breakthroughs came from immense amount of engineering design in the neural net architecture as well as the learning pipeline. However, to me, who really want to understand the underlying learning mechanism and want to get some kind of, say, guarantees that, okay, I can get back this information of the unknowns from the observes, then pure engineering feels a little bit less satisfactory. I want to see whether there exists some guarantees, okay? So unfortunately, the answer for sort of some kind of latent representation recovery guarantee is generally false unless you make some further assumptions on your neural network. So let me give you one more example. So suppose you are going to train a deep generative model to generate images. Okay, so there are a lot of different types of generative models right now in the market, but essentially you can think about them as processing a input noise variable, let's say a z variable, distributed in a Gaussian way via a super deep neural network, okay, to get the final image. Okay, but then if you think about the following example, where I first rotate the latent variable z, okay, with a rotation operator, and then I construct another neural network in a way that it first, reverse back this rotation operation and then copy the previous generator g, okay, then this second generation procedure here will actually give you exactly the same generation result every single time. Okay, so this is essentially the problem of non-identifiability. So essentially it says, if you have a latent variable model, which is only be trained on observation data, and you don't put any restrictions on the neural networks, then you cannot distinguish which generator you actually learned by purely looking into its generation results. And this also means the latent representations you can extract from the observed data will not be determined. Okay, so this might be problematic when you actually want to use your latent variables as some kind of representation later on for downstream tasks or for some interoperability applications. Because if the latent representation cannot be pinned down in a good way, then you don't actually know whether your analysis this time agrees with your analysis in another time. Okay. Okay, so this is the general issue of non-identifiability, and it is actually quite well known for the community of nonlinear ICA, but at least for the community of deep generative models. So this ICML paper is the first paper that point out this non-identifiability issue to the generative modeling people. Okay, I will encourage you to check it out. Okay. So now we've talked about these identifiability issues, but we should first get into the actual definition of identifiability. Okay, so it actually relates to this causal representation learning or causal discovery, because in causal discovery world, people also care about whether if I assume some kind of conditions of my graphs, can I still recover the causal relationship between variables in my graph from my data in a provable way. Okay, but just to say how it looks like in deep generative modeling setting. So here, we want to first write down what is called a structural causal model or a structural equation model, but also include a latent variable. For example, here, the structural equation would look like this. You start from a latent variable z, which might be some transformation of some noise distribution, and then your observation x comes from another transformation of your latent variable z plus maybe some exogenous noise. Okay, so here your transformation functions f and g, they are all defined by neural networks. And simultaneously, these equations also defines a probabilistic model, where the marginal distribution of your observations is computed basically by marginalizing your latent variables. Okay. So now the identifiability problem is defined as the following. So within this model class, if I have two models with different parameters that gives me the same general results, in other words, the same distribution for the observations, can I say anything about the equivalence relationship between the neural network functions parameterized by these different parameters? Okay, if we can say that the underlying neural network functions are actually equivalent up to some acceptable, equivalent class, for example, like permutation or affine transformation, then we can say that this class of deep generative model is identifiable. Okay, so the workflow of causal representation learning with deep learning model works like the following. You put down a your assumptions on these deep learning models, trying to see whether those class of deep learning models are identifiable. And once you fix the problem of identifiability, then you fit this class of model to the actual data you have in the real world, and then you check whether your fit is well. And if your fitting is well, then we can use the extracted latent variables from the fitting model to perform downstream tasks. For example, like interpretability or some other classification, or even answering some causal questions. Okay. So I'm not sure how many of you in the audience actually has background in causal inference or causal discovery, but at least when I talk about this idea to machine learning colleagues, they actually ask questions about why identifiability is important. Okay, so before saying the importance of that, I want to give you some caution of identifiability proofs. So identifiability proofs is not the same as learning and estimation guarantees, because it has quite strong assumptions. Okay, so it first needs to assume there is no model error, meaning that the underlying data generation process of your observations actually, belongs to the assumed model class. Okay, sounds quite strong, right? And furthermore, you need to assume your learning procedure corresponds to a consistent estimator of the parameters or of the functions, for example, like maximum likelihood estimation. You need to assume that you have a lot of data, and so that you can actually, get the global optimum of the optimization procedure and then recover the ground truth. Okay, so these are super restrictive, scenarios if you want to directly translate identifiability results of deep learning models to real-world performance. So this might sound very restrictive. Machine learning people might feel, okay, why should I care? So for that question, I would like to say a few things, right? So the first thing here is, if you come from the world of statistics, then you probably notice that identifiability is actually the fundamental concept of building statistical models. Because if you don't have identifiability conditions for your statistical model, then you can have no way to actually state anything about consistency results of your estimation results. Okay, so that is actually a prerequisite. In other words, it asks the question that if somehow I believe in my modeling choice of the data, then after fitting my model to the data, should I actually trust the discovery results? If you don't have identifiability for that, then you don't even bother. You should not even bother asking this question, because you shouldn't trust your model's discovery results. Okay. On another hand, for machine learning people, I would actually say that being able to store knowledge is not the same as being able to use knowledge. So nowadays, people actually use gigantic neural networks like transformers of millions or billions of parameters to train on massive data. So it's quite well known that those big foundation models are pretty black box, so very difficult to understand them, right? But they perform very well. And one interesting hypothesis in the field is basically saying that those foundation models are very good in terms of compressing the information available in the current data into the model. Okay, so that is basically like my point of storage. But if you know how the model can compress the information, but you actually don't know exactly where and which kind of information is compressed in which unit of the hidden layer in your foundation model, right? So that basically means you don't actually know how to use them, okay, unless you do further things. So in this sense, structural representations like what I'm going to discuss later will actually make these downstream use of these features much easier. Okay, so I think enough motivation. So I will actually start to tell you what we have done for the last few years, and specifically, I want to highlight this ICML paper published last year, led by my PhD student Carlos Bosas Rodas and my collaborator Yingzhen Wang at University of Michigan. So essentially, the motivation example for this project is our interest in segmenting these non-stationary time series. Okay, so in the world of causal discovery for time series, there is this idea of region-dependent causal discovery, which basically says, okay, you have a time series a sequence as your data, and your time series data might be non-stationary. Okay, but the non-stationarity comes from the switching behavior. For example, like in this dancing kind of video, right? This salsa video. So you can basically see that these two dancers, they actually dance in different moves according to different kind of, segment, like this spinning, okay, and basically moving forward and backward, right? So we are basically assume that the non-stationarity in your time series comes from perhaps the non-stationary switch between the regimes, but within the same regime, the dynamics may be stationary. Okay, so this is essentially our key assumption in the later on works. Okay, so after speaking of the assumptions, then we need to actually start thinking about what kind of models we are going to build. So we will start from this model called Markov Switching Model. Okay, and here I just show you the first order one. So you can think about it as an extension of the hidden Markov model in the sense that hidden Markov models won't have these auto-regressive links between your observations. And also in the literature, these Markov switching models sometimes are referred as auto-regressive HMMs, okay, because of these auto-regressive connections. So in this particular case, we assume that the latent variables here, as they are discrete, and they have a finite state space, okay, 1 to k, although we don't necessarily assume that we know k. Okay, and also we assume that for these autoregressive arrows, it follows a conditional first order Markov model, which basically means that condition on your switch state as the current observation depends only on one set of the previous observations. So these are our assumptions for now. Okay. So now I've shown you the model as a graphical structure. And remember previously I told you, right, from this disentangled video example that you should not trust me about stating anything about guarantees of recovery of the underlying causal structure unless I tell you about the assumptions of these modeling errors. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you that. So I'm going to tell you what are the assumptions needed for the neural networks to parameterize these errors in order to achieve identifiability for this model. Okay, so essentially this is the result that we prove in the ICML paper. Okay, so informally it says the following. So the first order Markov switching model is identifiable up to state permutation when you satisfy two conditions. Okay, so the first condition is basically unique indexing. So going back to the previous example of dancing, this basically just says that you cannot use the same index to the same index I or j, right? Well, you cannot use different index to denote the same dancing pattern. Okay, so this is essentially what unique indexing means. Okay, but more interestingly, we also said that for the autoregressive transition distribution for the observations, if you use Gaussian distributions for this transition distribution, then the mean function and the covariance function as a function of the previous time step observation needs to be analytic. in t minus 1, okay? So this might sound restrictive, but in practice it's not, okay? So this basically says we do not say any restriction in terms of the neural network architecture except for the activation functions. So you know that basically neural network can be viewed as a bunch of linear transformations, but composed with nonlinearities. So we are basically saying that you should use smooth activation functions like sigmoid, tanh. Try not to use ReLU. So if you do that, then essentially your constructed neural network will fulfill our assumption here in terms of analytic functions, and then you will have a identifiable latent variable model here. Okay, so the intuition of this result is the following. So you can think about switching, right, as discontinuities in time series, these kind of discrete changes that you are going to observe in your sequence data. Now, to model this kind of discontinuity in time series, there are actually two options you can have within this model of switching dynamic model. So the first idea is, okay, you can actually use these states, right? The changes of the states to represent these, discrete jumps. On the other hand, if you actually allow super flexible connections, the neural networks for these auto-regressive predictions, then it is possible that your neural network might be able to parameterize these continuous functions. Okay, we don't want to do that because otherwise you cannot attribute the discrete changes in your observed time series into, well, either the switch in your latent state or let's say the jumps in your transition functions for the observations. Okay, so what we are doing for this analytic function, this move function is just trying to remove the second possibility and make sure that you can attribute the discrete changes in your time series solely to the latent switching variables. So another thing to basically say about analytic functions, which might be interesting to you, is essentially it's actually stronger than the smooth function, in the sense that two analytic functions can only intercept at zero measure points. So this basically means in practice, the probability for you to observe two different, models giving you the same generation, this probability is actually 0. Okay, so this is basically why it is quite nice to use these infinitely smooth analytic functions. Okay, so yeah, so maybe just to let you know essentially why these things works out as for the proof if you're interested, right? So the idea for proving this thing is to view this model as a giant mixture model, okay? Because you can actually use the collection of the switches S1 to T as a index for a mixture over component over the paths. Okay, so I mean, so if you know mixture of Gaussians, then you can pretty much think about this S1 to T as sort of like your component index. And essentially, instead of using a single Gaussian, we are basically using some interesting distribution for the components. So this is just a giant finite mixture model. Okay, so now using some very classical results from my finite mixture model, it basically tells you that identifiability for finite mixture models requires something called linear independence of the family for this conditional distribution. So linear independence pretty much just means that, these conditional distributions are basically, basis of some function space. This pretty much like this, linear independence in this matrix and vector case. Okay, so we want to show linear independence of the conditional distributions, but then now we can start to use this first order Markov transition assumption here to factorize why this is sorry, can you still see my screen in a good way?
We can, but there's a red scribble on it.
Yeah, so I don't know what happened. Maybe let me just share again. Wait a moment. Okay, does it work now?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, good. Okay, no problem. Okay, so we just said that in order to prove identifiability, we just need to make sure that this the family of conditional distributions, they are linearly independent. Okay, so now we can start to use the first order Markov transition structure. Okay, so this allows us to factorize the big components distribution here into a product of these first order transition distributions. Okay, then we are going to start to use this idea of proving things by induction. So we are going to show linear independence for the conditional distribution for the first two time step first. And then we are going to prove this linear independence for the later case by induction. Okay. So the third step, which is essentially the steps that we spend most of the time in our development and also quite a lot of space in our paper, is trying to identify the conditions on this auto-regressive transition distribution to make sure that when you multiply them together, okay, the resulting distributions in this family, they are still linearly independent. So I will ignore the details, but essentially, we obtain certain linear independence and continuity conditions on this conditional distribution in a non-parametric case. So finally, we want to use neural network, which means we actually want to use a parametric model. So we decide to use Gaussians. That is actually quite a standard practice in deep generative modeling world. So this basically means we are going to use Gaussians with the mean and the covariance parameterized using neural networks. Okay, so and then we extend these linear independence and continuity conditions to this parametric case. At the end of the day, we arrive to this analytic in xt minus 1 condition to the mean and the covariance functions. Okay. So maybe let me just say a bit about why we need this kind of interesting proof strategy in terms of induction, right? So this result actually is very different from the classical identifiability result for hidden Markov models that was established basically in this paper, Alman et al., okay, in this Annal of Statistics. I think it's close to 20 years ago. So just to remind you, right, a hidden Markov model is basically this model, but you remove these autoregressive links between the observations. So the major problem of the difficulty for extending this HMM proof to our case is essentially this overlap, right? So when you multiply two conditional distributions together, you actually see that this xt appears in both this first distribution as a random variable and the second distribution as the conditioning variable. So this overlap actually makes the previous proof inapplicable, okay, in our case, and we actually develop a complete different proof strategy. Okay. So another interesting thing, which I think is actually quite exciting, is that our approach, because we use this kind of finite mixture model strategy by going back to the path indexing case, this basically means our proof actually makes no assumption on the latent discrete state transitions. Okay, so it actually means that our proof can also identify the joint distribution of the latent discrete states, which also indicate the identifiability of the conditionals. Okay, so this basically says the dynamic model for your latent state x1 to t can be non-stationary and high order Markov or even autoregressive. So by doing so, after marginalization of your latent state s1 to t, this also means the marginal distribution on your observations can also be non-stationary and higher order Markov. Okay, so we think this result is actually pretty interesting. So lastly, our proof can actually be extended to include some kind of observe control signals that people often use in, let's say, reinforcement learning setup, where your action or control signals are denoted by this sequence U1 of t. So if you assume your model with control signal as this with this interesting factorization, then essentially the proof will directly extend to this interesting case. Okay, so we've done the interesting proof, but at the end of the day, we still want to do videos. And if you think about it, right? So this particular model here, if you only have this in some small discrete latent states, it might be difficult to use them to model videos. Okay, so this is essentially what we are saying here, right? So previously for the model I described, we actually experimented with these segmentation problems of key point tracking data, okay, in our ICML paper, right? But obviously we want to do videos. Okay, and in particular for videos, we are actually not interested in this causal relationship between pixels. Okay, rather, we want to have some kind of latent representations that represent the objects in the videos, and then you can talk about essentially what are the relationship between the objects. So this prompts us to, lift the Markov switching model to another kind of latent hierarchy and build what we call, deep switching dynamical models. Okay, right? So here we actually have two layers of latent variable models. You can think about this X now here as basically the individual frames in this video. Okay, we first want to use these continuous latent variables z1 to t to get these representations from the raw video frames. And then we will model the kind of interactions of the features in this latent variable z using this switching dynamics, where here S is the discrete latent variables. Okay. So we can still ask the same question, okay, whether we can show identifiability for this model, given that we are going to parameterize this model and these errors, right, with neural networks. So the answer is yes. Okay, so informally, our theorem says, if you design the dynamic prior model in a way as we described before, which is using this identifiable Markov switching model prior, and then you ensure this emission function from your continuous latent variable z to x to satisfy certain conditions like continuous and injective, right? Then you can actually identify this model is actually identifiable, and you can identify these latent representations up to affine transformations and also permutations of your discrete states. There are relaxed conditions that you can apply, and also in that case, you will get weaker identifiability results. Okay, so this essentially says that, you can actually use fairly flexible neural networks, right? In this case, for your arrows here and also the emission function. And in particular, it allows the usage of certain leaky radio networks for your emission model. Okay. Actually, in this case, we didn't prove the big part of the results for this theorem. Instead, we actually used a previous result from this nearest 2022 paper. And their result basically says that if you have a identifiable mixture prior on your continuous latent variable z, and then you can put some conditions on this emission function f to ensure that you have identifiability of this latent variable model with mixture prior. So they've done this proof in the in static data case. We just try to extend the proof to the sequence modeling case by observing that in our previous result, we already have a identifiable finite mixture model for the latent dynamics. Okay, so I'm going to show you some results. So there are more results in the paper for you to see if you're interested, but I'm going to just show you two examples. So as we said, we are interested in videos. right? So in particular, we are interested in segmenting the video sequence. So this first video sequence is essentially the CMU motion cap data, which is actually a data set containing some dancing sequence. And my student colleagues render the motion capturing data into this 3D moving humans, human bodies. And then we want to see whether the model can learn to segment the video sequence, okay? And so there is no ground truth segmentation labeled here, so we can only get this interpretation, but at least our model has successfully segment the sequence into basically different patterns, like this moving backward and forward, and also rotation. Okay, and the reconstruction result for the video frames looks okay. We also extend this result to a slightly more real-world data set that is collected by some colleagues in UC Berkeley about straight dancing. So in this case, this is hip-hop dancing. So we do the same thing of feeding in this video sequence to the model, and then learn the model trying to see whether it can segment the sequence. So again, there is no ground truth. Okay, so we actually don't have the label, so we cannot tell you the segmentation accuracy, but we can only interpret from this visualization. So interestingly, this model actually now learn to segment the sequence according to actually the position of the dancer. Maybe it is because if you look at basically the movement of the dancers, right? They actually do different actions when they move to the different place of the stage. Okay, so yeah. So these are essentially the results that we have for the ICML paper last year. So we've also been trying to extend this result, okay, to various different kind of settings, just trying to make our model even more flexible. So the first question that you can ask is definitely like, okay, so why should I restrict myself into only like first order conditional transitions here, right? So we actually try to see whether our results can be extended to higher order Markov transitions. And my neuroscience collaborators told me that this will actually make more sense in neuroscience data, and the same confirmation coming from my cognitive science researcher collaborators. Okay, so some other things that you might want to consider here is previously our latent dynamics for the switches are essentially autonomous. So this basically says the latent dynamics here does not depend on your observation, which seems a little bit odd, especially in applications like control and model-based RL, because essentially when you move to another states of the world, right, then the underlying environment dynamics might change. Okay, so that it might lead to a different observation in next time step. So yeah, we try to extend our results to these different scenarios, but basically just for a quick summary in terms of the theory, identifiability works out still, but definitely you need to add in a little bit more assumptions to these extra errors that we have added to the models. But just to show you some kind of applications that we've investigated. So first, for this high order Markov switching model, so my neuroscientist colleagues and my student colleagues, we actually investigated this application to analyze this neural activity data. In this case, the data is collected from monitoring the monkey's brain signal by either monitoring during their awake phase, or artificially put them into sleep and then monitor their brain signal. Okay, so details are in this UAI workshop paper below. But essentially, what we found is that the higher order model is successful in terms of segmenting the neural activity data from the monkeys, and you can clearly see a difference between the awake states of the monkey and also the sleep state of the monkey. Okay, this behavior. And also, if you look at essentially our model selection procedure, where we are trying to test how many lags we should use in the model, essentially you can see that for the sleeping signal, right? So maybe first order Markov transition is already enough, but for the signals where recorded during the wake phase of the monkey, you actually need higher order information. Okay. So another example that we've done with this, observation condition transition dynamics for the latent is in this ICML paper, where in that case, we actually consider some more interesting setup. So for example, we actually try to understand essentially how different players interact in these basketball team play games. So we collected some data from this, NBA player trajectories. So this is a multi-agent data and obviously non-stationary. And the data format is essentially like the current location of the players as well as the location of the ball. Okay, and it is a time series data. So we first actually test out, how good our proposed model is as a forecasting machine when compared with just pure deep learning methods. So here, the pure deep learning method is variational recurrent neural networks here, so in gray. And there are some other methods like ACD, which was a previous method that we built on top in blue. Our approach is called SDCI, and we actually experiment with different hyperparameters, for example, like the number of different states. But essentially, the conclusion here is that the model we constructed, with identifiability guarantees, can actually perform well in the forecasting tasks where deep learning people cares quite a lot. Okay. Interestingly, we can also do some kind of slight out of distribution generalization, right, by training on the model on the data sets collected on Boston Celtics team only, okay, and then test whether you can actually generalize to the player trajectory from another team, in this case, Toronto Raptors. Okay, so this plot essentially just show you that the models can achieve slight generalization across different teams. Maybe because basketball gameplay strategies are fairly similar, even for different teams. So one interesting thing is to see essentially what kind of discrete states that this model can discover. So in this case here, I'm showing you essentially the states, the inferred states of a player, okay, according to its position on the court. Remember, the data here, observation, is essentially the position of the players. Okay, you can pretty much see that when you actually use 4 states, the basketball court is nicely split into 4, regions, where you can pretty much see that first this, boundary between these 2 states are pretty much close to 3-point line, and I can imagine, right, that the players' behavior will be different when they are close or far away from the 3-point line. And you can also see there is another kind of boundary close to the mid line of the court. So it will basically tell you that the player will switch from defense mode to attack mode. Okay, so some other interesting experiment that we've done together with collaborators in computational biology is trying to understand, whether we can discover the structures in gene regulatory network data. So bear with me that my biology is basically high school level, but essentially, what is going on here is that, by measuring basically these cell activities and basically this gene kind of expression data through time, people are trying to figure out essentially where there might be some kind of cluster of active genes that actually has this causal impact on some target genes. So the active genes are shown in these kind of say circles, and the target genes are shown in these gray nodes. Okay, so this is actually time series data because they will actually, the whole network will actually switch between different states, but essentially the idea is to see whether we can discover these arrows. Okay, So, well, the real world data is actually very expensive because you need to actually destroy cells. But essentially, on simulated data from our collaborators, we tested out our approach as well as different previous causal discovery methods, and it shows that our approach can work quite well. And these are essentially the graphs that we discovered from the data. So my biology colleagues said that these results are actually quite promising, and they are going to discuss these results in some computational biology conferences where I would love to hear their feedbacks from domain experts. Okay, so that's pretty much it of my presentation. But before closing, I want to also mention about what we've been doing so far and the limitation of our research. Okay, so I've spent quite some time to tell you identifiability is actually important. We can actually prove identifiability for deep generative models if you construct them in a careful way. And we also show that our constructed switching dynamic model with identifiability can still perform quite well in downstream tasks. Sometimes also match with pure deep learning methods. But again, there is still questions regarding fitting these identifiable deep generative models to data and also model checking. And there exists very little theory in terms of showing whether your estimation method or your learning method gives a consistent estimate of the parameters or the functions. So this part of theory is super difficult. Okay, so this is basically one of the big limitations of our approach. But again, another limitation is essentially whether our assumption is actually really realistic and useful if you really want to apply this to super high dimensional data sets. So just to show you, right, that you probably have already used quite some GenAI tools, and currently these video GenAI models are actually very, very good. Okay, they can actually generate pretty high resolution videos up to I think 1K at least, okay, of quite a few seconds or even tens of seconds. So those models are based on essentially transformers where you first are going to transform your frames into latent space, which is still the same as us, but then the latent space are going to be tokenized into something called these space-time tokens, and then you're going to apply a giant transformers to process them all at the same time. Okay, so this is non-causal at all because it does not actually respect the arrow of time, which is a key factor of causal discovery in time series. Okay, so what I'm trying to say here is that for the GenAI practice, when people only care about visual quality, people do not use causality motivated deep generative models. So this brings to the interesting question, looking forward to the future where, is end-to-end causal deep generative model ever possible? I mean, my view on this is that, as I said, right, so at least in video setup, right, we actually don't care about these low-level, details like pixels in terms of causal discovery. So we can definitely leverage deep learning methods to learn good representations from these low-level features. And hopefully these representations can actually represent, high-level information like objects that are really of interest for causal discovery. So once you get these representations, then you can do all the later causal discovery, for example, like these identifiable deep generative models on top of them. Okay, and then you can also take advantage from auxiliary data or even multimodality data. So that might give you extra signals. So ultimately, I mean, I will advocate something called scientific alchemy in the field of causal deep generative model research, which basically says we need to figure out essentially the theoretical limits in terms of identifiability and estimation. But after that, we should not stop. We can still continue our research with practical and engineering deep learning trick, and then leave the rest to the powerful perception of deep neural networks. So that's it. So I'm happy to answer your questions. If you're interested, you can look at these two papers. And I'd like to thank all of my awesome students and collaborators, especially for Carlos, because he actually made a lot of efforts to really make this line of work, work out for, theory, for experiment, and also for conference paper presentations.
All right, thank you so much. We're kind of up against the end of the session here, so maybe we have time for one question. I see Ricardo.
Hello. Since I have time for one question, maybe one question that interests me, Yingzhen. Thanks very much for your amazing talk. Is to what extent you think this method could be affected by irregular sampling of the time series? Because you may postulate there's a nice meaning for the index of time. The discrete time has a particular resolution, but in practice, in many cases, is irregularly sampled. At least in some cases that interests me. So how do you think this could affect this method?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. So indeed, so our approach actually assume a regularly sampled time series. So if you have irregularly sampled time series, then I presume maybe you want to actually use a continuous dynamic model like this, OD or SD governed latent dynamics. Now, the interesting question here is, if you think about extending our framework to continuous time, then it means that you need to actually think about these jumps. Okay, because this relies on the discrete changes. So I think there are actually some initial results talking about, identifiability of these latent variable models. If you put a neural SDE as its latent dynamics, but I actually don't know if there exists results for, let's say, jump SDE for latent dynamics. So that's pretty much like an open research area.
If you think, if you want to use as much as possible what we already did, if you just think about discrete time, but you just have irregularly observed samples within a discrete time, do you think we could tap into what you did relatively straightforward way, make maybe some assumptions about how much data is missing?
Okay. If we continue doing the discrete states or discrete time step one, then it means that you need to marginalize out, let's say, this missing time step observations, right? So I think I'm not sure, but I think this will actually mess up the proof strategy, because you will actually have problems in terms of identifying what is like this transition distribution, okay, from one time step to another time step after you're marginalizing out the intermediate ones. So we actually don't know how to address this kind of problem when you marginalize out some intermediate states.
If it's mixture of Gaussians, that's close on the marginalization.
Perhaps the problem is actually on, it is Gaussian transition, but the mean function is nonlinear in the previous states, right? So once you get that and you start marginalizing, well, things get very tricky.
Oh, thank you.
All right, so it seems like we're out of time for today. Once again, I'd like to thank our speaker for the wonderful talk, and thank you all for attending. Don't forget to check out the next Chai seminar with the event link posted in the chat. And yeah, thank you again, Dr. Li, for giving this excellent talk.
Okay, thank you very much.